Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Nolan Brown. I'm a blogger with the women's health site Bliss Tree.
And we've got lots of stuff to talk about today. Why don't we start with the question of whether men should be welcomed into feminism. You wrote about this recently. There was a controversy when a guy named Hugo Schweitzer wrote a blog post that some feminists objected to. Can you give us a little bit of background?
Yeah, he's been a pretty prominent male feminist blogger for a few years now, and had guest blogging posts at Jezebel and all sorts of sort of women's sites and feminist sites. And then he wrote about some of his personal relationships. He's a gender studies professor, and he wrote about previous sexual relationships with his students and about one time trying to kill himself and his ex-girlfriend when they were both, drug addicts.
Uh-huh.
And so a lot of people got very upset and said that, that was violence against women and he shouldn't be able to be a spokesperson for men and feminism and that sort of thing.
And to be clear, he wasn't defending these past actions. He was sort of saying them apologetically, or...
Right. He was remorseful, and he was just kind of, exploring his path to where he was now with his beliefs, in light of how he used to be. So, it was,
right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people were saying, given the things that this guy's done, we shouldn't be supporting him on sites that are supposed to be championing women. Why did you disagree with this?
Just because I think that Hugo has been a good, male feminist ally, I guess you'd say. And I think he's reached a lot of men about gender issues that otherwise wouldn't maybe consider it, especially with some of his work at the Good Men Project, which he actually ended up leaving over differences about some of the things that the founder was saying about gender. And I just think that, him writing about his personal experiences shouldn't be something that excludes him from being able to talk about feminism, as a project or in general.
Right. Well, so this kind of brings up a bigger question of what's the purpose of feminism, I guess? Is it political change, right? Is it creating a space for women to engage on their own? I mean, I think that traditionally feminism would be thought of as a movement that wants to affect social change. At the same time, when I read certain blogs that are sort of in, I guess, the feminist blogosphere, it seems like part of what they want to do is create a very specific community that sort of boosts women writers and that gives female commenters a place to talk about things that in, I guess, what they would call a safe space in the sort of college campus lingo. And I don't know. I mean, I don't object to those goals, I guess.
Yeah.
It does seem like maybe those goals wouldn't permit someone like, I'm forgetting his name, Hugo Schweitzer, to blog. But you kind of have a different idea about what these sites should be for.
Well, I mean, when I was writing about this, I said, a lot of these sites, like Feminist and Pandagon, and not that he blogged there, but just a lot of these sites are ones that I first started reading when I first started reading feminist blogs and was like, oh my gosh, I'm a feminist. And I just had a conversation with my little cousin who just turned 22, and she kind of just said the same thing. So I think you're right. I think these blogs serve a really good function, and they kind of introduce people to the idea that feminism is relevant. And like you said, they provide a safe space for people. And I can totally see why, certain places might not want Hugo to continue blogging for them, or how his admissions might, be seen as problematic, as people say, and something to spawn discussion. So I don't think that it's wrong for people to be questioning that, but I just think a lot of the commentary was along the lines of, this guy's an abuser, why are we letting him talk about feminism? Or thing has a name, it's gendered violence, and he should have brought up the fact that it was gendered violence, and he didn't.
Yeah, there's just kind of thread running through a lot of internet discussions, even beyond feminism, I think, where there's a tension between wanting to stigmatize certain things on one hand and wanting to have a sort of wide-ranging, robust exchange of ideas on the other hand. And I generally side on having a robust exchange of ideas. I think that we're all better off in the long run if things get aired out instead of lots of people who have certain attitudes or who have certain things in their past just pretending them away, being afraid to talk about them for fear of stigma. I'm also a little bit, I'm always interested in this idea of the sort of ever-changing definition of feminist. And, it's usually talked about all the different waves of feminism is the way that you generally hear talked about. I don't know. I mean, do you think that someone like me, am I a feminist? And by someone like me, I mean, someone who has a broad commitment to women's equality and rights, but at the same time is more of an individualist than someone who wants to look at rights through the lens of different groups.
I don't know, Connor. Are you a feminist?
I don't know. I guess it depends on who you would ask. I think there'd probably be intense disagreement about that question, maybe.
I mean, I would say that you are, but I know of your views and your writing and your personal life, and I think that it's good for men to say that they're feminists when they appreciate I don't think the basic tenets of feminism are that controversial. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't like the whole idea that men can't be feminists just because they're men.
Right. So in the same universe of topics, there is a very controversial post by our mutual friend, James Poulos. He wrote a column at the Daily Caller, and the provocative title was, "What Are Women For?" And I think that title on any piece would have been controversial. And James ended up writing a second piece after being attacked where he tried to sort of explain himself and what he was trying to say. And he followed up with a third piece, a blog post on his personal blog, going into further detail. I would argue that the third piece, his blog post, actually did the best job of getting across his ideas. Now, I had a little bit of a hard time with this controversy just because I know James. I've known him for a long time. I know that his views don't conform to the sort of least charitable interpretation of what people were saying about his article. But I think to sort of sketch out the controversy, I think, people were upset with the title, I think for good reason. I think it's legitimate to be upset about the idea that that we should talk about women in this way that is sort of as if they're an object rather than a person, I guess. And the title at least seemed to do that. I don't think that James's ideas were necessarily doing that. And I guess I'd like to hear your take on what I think James's actual argument was, which was that because women and women alone are able to have children, they have a special role in society if they choose to take it, and they're not obligated to take it, but they can if they want to. And so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, knowing James, and James edited a few of my pieces back at Culture 11, and I've read him for a long time. I kind of know how he writes, and I think, he writes in a very sort of dense academic / philosophical style. And I think that because what he was writing was kind of hard to understand and convoluted, and because it was on a conservative site, the Daily Caller, and because it had the provocative title, "What Are Women For?", which being a blogger, I understand that sometimes you have to kind of title things in ways that don't exactly make your point clear, or they're more provocative than you. But I just think that since all of those things together, people just took James's post to be a lot more like misogynist or socially conservative than he meant it to, mostly because they just weren't clear what he was talking about, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. But yeah, so what about what he was talking about? Do you have a strong opinion on it, or are you sort of
what I
undecided?
took from what he was saying is that, and especially in his post on his own blog where he was clarifying it, there's this one sentence where he was like, I disagree with social conservatives about the wisdom or necessity of enforcing their judgments on nature, women, and choice. So what a lot of people, sorry. I think that what he was saying was that because women have this like privileged natural relationship to fertility and birth and all of these things, which people took to mean as that they should be obligated to fulfill that role, he just meant that because we have more say in it, we should have more say in reproductive choices. He does mention that, and I think it's very strange that that's such a like. He kind of frames in the idea of personal liberty, because that's such an argument that is like anathema to social conservatives, that women have any sort of special right to talk about their own reproductive future, I think.
Well, yeah, it's sort of...
And that's how I took him to be saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that a core plank of a lot of left-leaning feminists is that women should have the ability to control their bodies and their fertility, basically without any sort of outside restraint, right? This is not controversial at all for the vast majority of the American left and a lot of centrists and tons and tons of women. And I think that they would say it's interesting because the way that they talk about it, right? They talk about fertility, I think, in a way that frames it as more of a burden than a right, if that makes sense. It's like if a woman is pregnant, her body is the one that is bearing the costs of this pregnancy, the inconvenience of it, the intrusiveness of it, and therefore she should, it's her body, therefore it is her choice. So she should get to make this decision about whether to carry a pregnancy to term. And whoever it was that she is having, whoever it was that she conceived with, should not have a say in this matter. And it's interesting that James sort of twists it around a little bit and wants to say that he doesn't frame it as a burden. He frames it as a, I don't know if I would say blessing. He frames it as a reality that women have
capability.
Yeah, well, but he frames it in a positive way. I'm trying to think of his exact words. He says women have a privileged relationship with the natural world. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that.
I don't agree with that
women
either.
Aren't able to conceive alone, of course, and so you need, you need a man in the process. But yeah, I wonder if the positive framing wasn't responsible for the controversy somehow. It's just a radically different way of looking at pregnancy and fertility. And I wish I would love to see James do a blogging head with one of his critics who I think didn't quite address the point he was making as much as the point that the Daily Caller headline writer sort of skewed the conversation toward.
Yeah, I think when I went through all of James's posts together and read some of the things people were saying about it, I think he was trying to frame something that actually a lot of people who were arguing against it would agree with, in terms that a socially conservative audience might be sympathetic to.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And that's a very hard thing to do, to write about these subjects in a way that social conservatives and liberals will both read it and even take the ideas seriously at all.
Right.
And this is actually something I've thought about a lot, that I think because I have been working in media for a long time and because I went to a relatively liberal college, I've become attuned over the years to the way that people talk about these issues. I don't mean the substance of my views, which I want to hold separate from this conversation. I'm just talking about the rhetoric, the tone, the kinds of caveats that you make. Sometimes you have to say, to be clear, I'm not saying this offensive thing, even though that offensive thing isn't even implied by your argument, right? But you have to make that caveat sometimes, just to make sure that your point is going to get across. And I think that this is a big problem for sort of public discourse generally in the United States, that as media becomes more and more sort of nichified and partisan, it gets harder and harder to write about things in a way that different people are going to take seriously. And I think that for someone like myself, and for someone like James too, it's particularly hard because neither one of us are coming from a space of just trying to write for the right or just trying to write for the left. And I think you're the same way. We're all trying to interact in this space where, we have some critiques of the right and some critiques of the left, and our views don't sort of fit very well in any particular way. And it's very frustrating to write something, right, and then to have it spread beyond our circle of regular readers and to just have knee-jerk reactions on both sides. I don't think in this case that James did the best job that he's ever done of choosing the right language and choosing the right way to do this. But it's a really difficult thing to do. And I understand how you can make, how you could not always get it just right. I certainly don't. So let's talk next about contraception. It is a big topic of controversy. And my question for you is, should contraception be free?
That's a hard question for me. I think within the context of the fact that a lot of preventative services are free, and some of these things are like syphilis testing, and a lot more men and women are going to be affected by unplanned pregnancies than syphilis. So I think in the sense that all these preventative services, insurances are required to cover them, then birth control should be included in that. Contraception should be included in that. And that there are good reasons for that to be the case.
But one thing you often hear is that Viagra is covered, and
I don't know if it is or not.
Well, when contraception wasn't covered, there were various activists who would say, "Look, insurance company, you cover Viagra, and therefore you should cover birth control for reasons of gender equity, for sort of non-discrimination reasons." I don't know how I feel about that actually, because on one hand, one way you could look at it is that men, there's nothing, a man who's, a 65-year-old guy, if he can't have sex anymore, is not going to die from it. He's not going to get sick from it, right? So is it healthcare in that sense? Well, not in that sense. It is healthcare in the sense that something has gone wrong with the natural functioning of his body. He can't do this thing that his body was designed to do. At the same time, it's indisputably natural that as people age, they stop being able to have sex. So I think it's a really thorny thing to figure out, what is this thing? And contraception, right, on the other hand, I don't know. I guess the fact of the matter is that there is no direct analogy because only women get pregnant. And so it's hard to find a direct analog. I don't know if I think that Viagra is a direct analog. I guess my position...
only women get pregnant, but I think, unplanned pregnancies affect men and women. So it's something that's kind of in the general public interest.
Yeah, well, I think that's true, that certainly it affects men and women, and unplanned pregnancies certainly also affect society as a whole.
Right.
I guess where I come down, I think that it's a good public policy to subsidize birth control for people who cannot afford it on their own. And I would encourage that. I also would like to broaden access to contraception. Like, I think you should be able to get the pill without a prescription, for example.
Yeah, I think that would help a lot.
Yeah.
Over the counter.
But I also don't think that it should. I don't think that we should subsidize contraception for people that can afford it, for like upper middle class people, for rich people. I don't think that, and it frustrates me to hear this issue framed as one of access to contraception, because I'm very pro access to contraception. I want everybody to be able to get contraception. And I have no problem with people using it, and I have no problem with people having, sex before marriage and all this sort of thing. But it just seems to me that if we're subsidizing birth control for rich people, everyone wants to frame it as a victory for women, and it doesn't seem that straightforward to me. Like, it seems like, I began this conversation by saying, should birth control be free? But of course, it can't be free, right? Like, people are paying for it through higher insurance rates. People are paying for it. In the end, people are paying for it. To me, it's just a matter of how is this redistribution taking place? And to me, when you subsidize contraception for everyone, like, who is winning and who is losing in this? Like, the people that are winning are people who are using it a lot. So, like, married couples, right, who are having sex and don't want to have kids for like years and years on end and using contraception. The men and women in those relationships are winning. Whereas, like, a single woman who is not having sex for like 5 years is sort of losing in that redistributive framework, as is, a gay person or a lesbian person who's never going to use contraception at all. And I just don't see any, I don't see the justification for that kind of redistribution taking place.
Maybe this doesn't, answer all of what you just, all of the problems with what you just said. But I think one of the things that's interesting about it is that, you tend to think of this in terms of birth control pills, right? And so you're saying, the federal government's going to be subsidizing birth control for middle class and rich women, and, the pill with the copay is, $5 to $30. So, big deal. But one of the things it would do actually is pay for long-term birth control, which is actually a lot.
Like implant devices?
Yeah, like IUDs and even sterilization. I think the Guttmacher Institute did a study about how, 37% of people would choose sterilization, either vasectomies or tubal sterilization for women, I guess. And all of the cost of these things, like IUDs or those operations, would be more upfront, and the kind of things that a lot of people can't afford upfront, but that would be more effective long-term birth control and be cheaper than unplanned pregnancies for the insurance companies,
Right. This is actually, I've been trying to look into this, and I haven't completely finished, but it's strange to me that I've seen a bunch of people argue that this is cheaper for insurance companies in the long run. And if that's true, I don't understand why they didn't all do it to begin with. And I'm not making a statement at this point that it is or isn't true. I just don't understand why, if it is ultimately cost effective, why this wouldn't just happen without any sort of government mandate.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not totally for the idea of there being a government mandate about these kinds of things to begin with. I just think that because there is, that contraception should be included among it.
Right, if we're going to have government mandates for all these other things that an insurance covers, this one makes sense relative to the other
exactly.
things. Yeah. So another related issue related to contraception and childbirth and family planning. This is a David Brooks quote that he said in a recent column. Let's see if I can find it. People in the educated class talk like social progressives and behave like traditionalists. And this is kind of a critique you hear a lot, that that if the upper class started setting a better example for society, that the lower classes, who are really the ones hurt by out of wedlock pregnancy, right, would benefit. That I guess, I mean, one way to say this would be that, sure, it's all well and good for people like Murphy Brown, who are, you know, who are rich, basically, to have a kid on their own as a single parent, but by their behavior, they create this norm that when people who are less rich do it, then it's a bad thing for society as a whole. So we both, I think, read this blog post responding to this that was written by Phoebe and Maltz. And actually, I think, did she get married? Did her last name change?
Maltz Bovey now, I think.
All right. We will link to her blog, which I'm sure will have the right last name. But yeah, so she basically said that conservatives keep making this argument, but in fact, they don't really want progressives to preach what they practice. They don't really want, or I guess rich elites rather than progressives. They don't really want the elite to preach what it practices, because what it practices is actually, you know, multiple years of premarital sex, but being very careful about not having an unintended pregnancy happen, right? And also what the elite practices is toleration of gays, and that and that they would have to preach all of these things if they really wanted the lower classes to adapt. So I don't know. I'm not long enough. Do you have thoughts about this?
Well, I think along with what you're saying, it's not just that. And by elites, you know, I think he's talking anyone with a college degree, anyone, you know, because of how much more the college educated people marry now, and there was just something out today about, like, I don't know, over half of births to people under 30 are out of wedlock now, which I guess is the first time that it's been more than not, or than are married.
Okay.
But
right.
But I think she was saying.
Yeah, Katie Royfey wrote about this recently.
Okay. But so not just as you know, they might have these certain, like, traditional arrangements, but they also, like you said, have more sympathy for, like, gay marriage and for gender parity within their own relationships. And that actually makes a difference, that relationships where there is a fair amount of gender parity and relationships where people have had a fair amount of sexual experiences before marriage, and where people are feminists end up having, you know, better relationships, better marriages, and better sex, and all of these things. So, I think she was saying, you know, you can't cherry pick. Well, look, they have these traditional sort of family structures. They're talking the same thing that, like, 1950s social conservatives are.
Right. I mean, it seems possible to me that there are different models of successful social norms surrounding family and reproduction, and that, you know, the sort of red American ideal and the blue American ideal could both work, but they can't work together. Like, the worst of both worlds is like mixing and matching from them in a way that seems to be happening, right? And I wonder, I mean, to me, there's no going back to the red American preference on these things. It's just impossible. Like, I don't exactly understand. I mean, I guess my problem with the Brooks critique and with the Charles Murray critique is that even if implausibly the upper class decided that they wanted to come along and set a better example for the underclass in America, right? How exactly would they communicate this? How exactly would this happen, right? How if everyone who's attending elite colleges sort of started listening to Caitlin Flanagan and hooking up less on campus And, would this actually filter down? I suppose you could argue that, these people would graduate and become like staff writers on some future Gilmore Girls equivalent, and then they would write plot lines that sort of change the way that cultural values are being communicated. I don't know. It just seems implausible to me that there's any actual mechanism that the elite, which is never going to agree to this, would in fact be able to change the opinions of others.
Well, right, and also if you have progressive values, you can believe that in having children, even like any number of like traditional family or whatever structures are okay for you, but not that they should be the norm, or that in recognizing that reality exists and they're not the norm, that we shouldn't just try to like wish them back into existence, but we should deal with the reality and try and like make that our base for starting to try and find solutions,
Yeah. When I think about it, past eras in American life, when there were very different norms, it's true that if you turned on television, if you turned on, Leave It to Beaver, or you turned on all of the TV shows where the husband and wife, slept in separate single beds, I Love Lucy style.
Right.
It's true that the culture that elites created was much more friendly to American social norms, but I think it's a mistake to go back and think that is what was that is what was keeping things in check. I mean, I think that obviously advances in birth control changed a lot. Advances in different kinds of technology changed a lot. I also think that laws changed a lot, right? I mean, changes in divorce law had a huge impact on family formation and how long families stayed together. And
everything. I mean, the economy and the job situation and...
Right. Yeah. I guess it seems to me that social conservatives want to sort of look back and pretend as if it's all about the social norms, because there's so little support for going back to what we now think of as like coercive divorce laws. There's so little support for going back to the more heavy-handed things that government was doing to sort of keep nuclear families intact in this traditional model. And we also don't want to go back to the sort of meaner strain of cultural norms, right? Of criticism of unmarried women as spinsters, or like, gay as closeted, or all this sort of thing. Another thing that Phoebe tries to argue is that social conservatives should want gays to marry because otherwise they might stay closeted and marry straights, and we can manage
which is like a really weird argument for conservative support of gay marriage. Like, I haven't heard that one before until I read Phoebe's post.
And I must say, I'm not entirely persuaded by it.
I'm not
either. I think that,
I suppose. I mean, there's some merit to that. I don't.
There are instances when what she says is true, I would say.
Right.
I would doubt that it is
it'd be significant, but
yeah. Well, so let's see here. Let's move on to stuff you've been writing about. So I understand a site that you read at Bliss Tree. It is Eating Disorder Week.
It is National Eating Disorder Awareness Week. Yes.
Got it. So yeah, what should we be aware of this week other than that eating disorders exist? What don't we understand about eating disorders that we ought to?
Well, I just want to promote my co-writer at Bliss Tree, Hannah, put up today a really interesting history of eating disorders piece, which talked about fasting for religious reasons and just all these different manifestations of anorexia throughout history. It's really interesting. But as far as current events right now, there's actually some interesting stuff, I think, concerning eating disorders this week. I mean, not this week, but right now, kind of in general. There's the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. They're adding some new eating disorders to it, or they're talking about it, and so It would make binge eating a disorder, and it would make certain forms of like picky eating almost a disorder. So an eating disorder. So that's kind of a controversy right now.
So what does it mean? What does it mean when something goes from behavior we all sort of agree isn't good to official disorder?
A lot of times they do it for like diagnostic, for like insurance reasons, because if someone has a code for something, you know, then if they can give them a diagnostic code, then certain, I don't know, billing things happen, and then it's like a certain treatments are recommended certain medications. So it kind of is like the guidelines on how psychiatrists and psychologists should diagnose people. So it does have effects on, you know, I think like once categories of disorders are created, then people get diagnosed with them more often.
Right, yeah, I think that's definitely true. I'm curious about whether it changes the psychology for the person being diagnosed, whether it's easier or harder to change a behavior if you think that it is
pathological,
you know, an official medical condition, right? And I don't know the answer to that.
I'm not sure.
So it seems like there's a lot more awareness than there used to be of eating disorders. I'm trying to remember. I think that my first awareness of eating disorders was when the girl from Growing Pains had
Tracy Gold. Yeah, she starred all the Lifetime movie eating disorder movies too.
Yeah, and it seems. Am I right that this sort of that eating disorders started being talked about in the late 80s or the early 90s or something? Or is this just when I became aware?
I learned this morning from Hannah's post, actually, that I think it was the late 70s that some psychologist wrote a book that first started explaining eating disorders, the psychology of it, and all of that. So, so it really was in the 80s and 90s that started reaching, I think, people in general, awareness of eating disorders.
Right. Huh. Okay. Yeah, I'm picturing the More You Know commercial in the old NBC style with the rainbow across the screen.
Or Saved by the Bell episodes.
And, and so you probably have a better sense of this than me. Has the conversation changed substantially since then? I mean, what I took to be the message then is, you know, these eating disorders exist. They're very tragic. They're anorexia and bulimia are the big ones that you heard about, and I think that the awareness message was sort of be aware that these things are out there. If you observe them in other people, maybe say something, intervene. That was certainly the message when I was they called a sponsor at Pomona College, like a sophomore that lived in a freshman hall. They sort of trained you in be on the lookout if someone is always, you know,
after dinner,
leaving the table when everyone's at dinner multiple times or whatever. The warning signs that I've probably forgotten most of by now. But I guess I'm just interested in, is this still basically the message? Has the message basically not changed, or are there new things that I'm unaware of? Would I be learning different things if I were being trained now to oversee college freshmen?
I think there's a lot more awareness these days that eating disorders aren't necessarily about just like weight or body image or size, you know, that there's a lot of aspects of control and obsessive compulsive behavior that kind of contributes. And I think people are more aware of that. I also think, you know, there are really specific criteria you have to meet to be diagnosed anorexic or bulimic. And so on the one hand, there's all these new categories of eating disorders that are, you know, in there. And I mean, like I said, there are maybe bad things about that, but there are also maybe good things because there's a lot of, I think Americans' relationship to food just keeps getting increasingly dysfunctional. So there's a lot of categories of disordered eating that aren't necessarily anorexia or bulimia that are still like problems in people's lives.
Well, so tell me more about what do you mean when you say that our relationship to food is getting more dysfunctional?
Well, I write about food and nutrition all the time at Bliss Tree, and you know, just with America's obesity rates and with all of the kind of prevailing wisdom about how we're supposed to eat for so many years that we knew kind of being turned on its head recently and all of that. So,
yeah, but I guess what do you what I was wondering is I certainly agree that obesity is a growing problem. No pun intended. But what about? I was wondering if you were including sort of foodie culture in that in that critique. There's the suddenly famous scene from that show Portlandia where the couple sits down at a restaurant and the waitress comes over and they have a sort of long conversation about the provenance of the food that they're about to order, and they start hearing about, I think it was a chicken, how the chicken has been, where it was raised and what its name was and the name of the farmer and how many miles it is from town. And then the punchline is that they sort of decide that they're going to get up and actually hold their table while they go to the farm and meet the chicken farmer themselves. And I don't know, is that dysfunctional? Is it dysfunctional that, that whole swaths of culture in cities are obsessing over the latest gastropub? It certainly lends itself to mockery, right? And yet, food has always been central to humanity, and we eat 3 times a day. Might as well enjoy it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think anything taken to the extreme is a problem. So there are people who, and that's another one of the new potential eating disorders. I don't know if it's in the DSM proposals or not. I haven't heard much about it, but about like kind of an obsession with healthy eating being a kind of disordered eating too, and it can be. I think any of those things taken too far can be. But as far as like the whole foodie culture goes, in general, the more awareness that people have, I think, of how food is made and produced and how to eat healthily, I think is good. And I think, if it gets a little silly at times with things like the bone luge and all of that, like it's still okay. Like I think it's a good thing all in all.
I actually know the person that claims to have started.
I do too, Jacob. I interviewed him for Bliss Tree about it actually a few weeks ago.
So you've gone from living in Greenpoint, New York, to Indiana. What are your observations of the differences? I mean, I feel like Greenpoint was a place with a great local farmers market and lots of restaurants that were trying to be on the cutting edge of the foodie movement and the localism movement as well. What's it like living in Indiana? Have these things spread to the middle of the country, or is it just a completely different world?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, like, there's a farmer's market a few blocks from my house here in Indiana, and I live in Lafayette, by the way, Lafayette, Indiana. There's a farmer's market a few blocks from my house. There's a natural food store. There's, at the Kroger's, like, a huge natural food section. Yes, they have somewhat. I miss all the restaurants in Brooklyn. And, I was involved with Crazy Foodies there. All of my roommates, volunteered at the Eagle Street rooftop farm and, made raw vegan nut pate and ice cream and whiskey and stuff. So it was just a very weird culture to be immersed in. But, I don't know. I think that it's definitely everywhere.
Yeah, well, when Courtney and I were driving cross country a while back, I guess it's been a couple of years now, one thing that I was sort of attuned to on menus as we would go across the country, it seemed like the thing that separated, I don't know how to designate these restaurants, maybe the kind of restaurant I would prefer is a good way to put it, was that there was goat cheese on the menu, right? This was the great marker of how ambitious a restaurant's cuisine was. This wasn't totally true. Like we ate a ton of great barbecue places. We ate at a ton of great places in New Orleans. It was kind of the Cajun cuisine that I grew up with because that's the part of the country my mom's family came from. But sort of outside the distinctive food of a region, which I think is separate. If it was just a sort of general quote unquote American food restaurant. goat cheese was the trend that sort of made it from the cities to the rest of the country, from the coastal cities to the rest of the country. I wonder.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No.
When I was home with I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I was home visiting family. We went to some very sort of typical pulled pork and pulled chicken pub kind of place. And it made a point of mentioning on the menu that the chicken was free range or hormone free or something. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. But yeah, so I wonder, maybe that's the next thing. I was going to say, I wonder what the next thing will be that isn't goat cheese. I think maybe, it might have been beets too. I feel like beets got very big.
Oh God, beets are everywhere. I hate them too. I wish they'd go away.
Oh really? I'm a fan of beets. I'll take your beets. Let's see. But yeah, and I'm trying to think, I'm hoping that the cocktail culture is going to spread like goat cheese. I don't know if this will actually happen. It's been interesting in LA. There's this huge Portland bartender diaspora in LA. People that got their start in that city of 600,000 people and have now sort of invaded the greater LA metro area and are working at all of these very ambitious cocktail bars. And there's a great piece in the Weekly Standard by Robert Messenger, actually, about the cocktail movement and about how, several generations ago, cocktails in American life were this sort of very sophisticated American invented thing. And, some people say that it started in New Orleans. Some people dispute that. But over the years, cocktails sort of went away so that for decades and decades in American life, through the 60s and 70s and 80s and early 90s, you couldn't get a well-made cocktail. People wouldn't even know what you were talking about if you ordered an old-fashioned. You could basically go to a bar and get gin and tonic or rum and coke, and to this day, you go to a restaurant like a chain restaurant like the Cheesecake Factory, and they will have a menu that is in many ways a very ambitious menu for the range of stuff that it offers, and yet the cocktail menu it's sort of terrible.
Lots of fancy martinis.
Well, yeah, lots of fancy martinis and lots of. The Cheesecake Factory puts simple syrup, at least if the bartender that I talk to is a reliable source, adds simple syrup to its gin and tonic, for example. And I get that's basically it. It's just cheating, right? It's just like putting a bunch of MSG in something or butter in some food, or they probably do that too, maybe. But I don't know. I think that I only discovered good cocktails in the last probably 5 years, and I think back to what I drank before. I think, wow, you could have a lot better drink than that. So I hope this spreads. I'm all for this sort of culture improving. I think this is a kind of culture that improves broadly, and lots of people get access to better things. I wrote this piece. I don't know if you saw it in the Atlantic about beer, and Charles Murray. One of the things he was arguing.
Sorry, John.
One of the things he was arguing in his book was that people who drink was that the elite. His big argument is that the elite is in a bubble and separated from the life that the white middle class or the white working class live. And one of his questions to demonstrate this to the elite was, when was the last time you bought domestic mass market beer? And I've talked about this actually on Blogging Against before with Noah Millman, that I want to say no. It is a good thing if people move on and discover that there are beers that they can buy for the same price as Budweiser and Coors that are way better. Let's see here. So what do you think about this?
Hold on. I'm gonna say something about that, all right? What you were just talking about? I'm not a cocktail snob by any means. I just I don't like liquor, so I've never gotten into the whole cocktail resurgence that's been happening a whole lot. I like wine and beer. But I think with what you said about cocktails and about beer, and I think that's all true, and it also applies to food. Like, there's a lot of foods that are good for you and not that expensive, and people just stopped eating for a long time. Or there's a lot of, like, foods that are, like, startup fancy kind of, like, restaurants in cities, and then they kind of, like you said, like, spread around the country. So, like, eventually, like, better food, like, better quality food and healthier food is, like, kind of trickling across the country, I think, hopefully. And that's one of the benefits, too.
Is there anything particularly you have in mind? Like, what kinds of foods you're talking about? Wheat pasta, perhaps?
Wheat pasta, yeah, I love wheat pasta. And even, like, salad greens, like, until not very long ago, like, you had iceberg or maybe romaine, and now, like, all sorts of people have all sorts of different spinach and arugula and all sorts of different salad greens at, like, O'Charlie's or whatever, your typical, like, suburban restaurants, so...
Right. Have you seen the cost of arugula lately? Man. So yeah, I agree with that. But yeah, so let's talk about the presidential election.
Okay.
What were you an Obama supporter in 2008? I do not remember.
And I'm sorry if you hear my dog growling.
That's all right.
Chris! I was not an Obama supporter in 2008. I mean, I guess I was. I wasn't really an anybody supporter.
Yeah, okay. And are you still a no one supporter?
More or less, yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of people observing the Republican primary are sort of horse-struck by the candidates. Is this your take? I mean, do you think, does it seem like a weak field to you, like a lot of people are saying? Do you think that it's just typical politics, it's no worse or better than it's ever been? And yeah, go ahead.
I don't know. I haven't seen that many presidential elections yet, or paid attention to even fewer. It seems bad. I like Ron Paul, but he doesn't have any chance of winning, and so I don't really support anybody in particular. But I just think it's kind of crazy some of the things that are getting talked about in this Republican primary a lot. Like we were just talking about birth control, so the whole focus on birth control in the primaries and stuff is just like a weird issue for everyone to be focusing on when there are so many other issues right now.
Yeah, it is unexpected, I think. At least I wouldn't have expected it. And so do you think that you will... has Indiana had its primary? I don't even know.
I don't know. I am not registered to vote in Indiana yet.
Okay, so do you think you'll vote in the general election?
I don't know yet.
All right, so you are maybe winnable by one of the candidates, maybe. I think I will vote for Gary Johnson in the general election. Vote for the Libertarian. He will probably be the Libertarian Party candidate. I can't.
My dad votes a straight Libertarian Party ticket all the time. So.
I like actually. So the one intriguing thing about Gary Johnson's candidacy, the standard critique of voting Libertarian, among others, is that they're never going to win. You're just throwing your vote away, et cetera, et cetera. Gary Johnson was a 2-term governor of New Mexico, and he left office very popular, and his name recognition is obviously huge there. And it could be that Gary Johnson could win New Mexico. I mean, it's unlikely because people tend to understand that would mean that Gary Johnson isn't going to win the national election, so why vote for him in New Mexico? But it's still, he could win. He could draw a significant amount of support from another candidate. He could certainly change the outcome in New Mexico. But I would argue that New Mexicans should totally vote for Gary Johnson because I think it would be a huge milestone for libertarians and for third parties generally to have someone who isn't a Republican or a Democrat to win a state. And that once that happened, maybe you would see less of a stranglehold by the Democrats and Republicans. Maybe not. It's hard to get ourselves out of the sort of pathologies of the two-party system that we're in. But personally, I would like to see Gary Johnson win a state. I would love it if Gary Johnson won a state and Buddy Roemer won, Louisiana. And alas, I don't think I'm going to be satisfied. But what can you do? So another thing, I guess we can close on this maybe. We both are ex-DC residents. I spent only 2 or 3 years there. You were there for how long?
I was there for 3 years, and then I was back for about 5 months again later, after a few years.
Okay. And so this is something that we've talked about before, just on our own, that DC has a very particular culture of sort of the young people that come and staff the various, publications, the world of journalism that we were in, and the world of nonprofits and think tanks, and also congressional offices, and it attracts a certain kind of person that has a certain kind of culture. So do you think that DC's culture matters to the way that these institutions are run?
Well, earlier when you kind of mentioned something about how you have to say things about certain things, like you see something and you have to qualify. I don't mean this, or because you just kind of are versed in of the internet or the language of how people talk about different political things these days. And so one of the things that's interesting is oh God, this is going to make, whatever. I grew up in the Midwest, so I'm totally a Midwesterner, but back here in Indiana, I met a lot of people who just are not in the media at all, are not in politics at all, and are just so much less savvy of the way you're supposed to talk about things. And it's really interesting and refreshing. But so I think, I don't know. Yeah, I think there's kind of a self-censoring that happens when, with writers and with people that are closely associated on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my sort of critique of DC is that it's a place that really encourages selling out. And people go there. A lot of people go there very idealistic, and it's just that the career paths that are available to people reward partisan hackery and ideological hackery, reward loyalty to other DC insiders at the expense of the larger ideals that you're ostensibly fighting toward. The nonprofit sector is very donor-driven.
Yeah.
And so you have a think tank that ostensibly stands for X, but its donors care about, parts of X, but also these other things. And there are certain things that you can't really say if you work for these think tanks because you don't want to alienate your donors. And, it's not that these things, these pathologies are unique to DC. It's just that the whole politics and public policy industry is so focused there. And I think that it's difficult. It's also difficult because there's this huge overlap between work and social groups. So, living in LA, very few of my friends work in the industry that I'm in. And that means that I can do something that is controversial in my industry. I can write something that's controversial. I can take an unpopular position among my colleagues, in the press. And it doesn't really affect what parties I get invited to. It doesn't really affect, my life out on a Friday night. And I think that that's a good thing. I think that one idea that's sort of my crazy idea that I really believe in is that it would be a great thing if we dispersed the organs of government around the country instead of having them all in DC. If we sort of relocated the Supreme Court to Omaha or something, and maybe we put some federal agency in, Idaho, and that we had Congress where congressmen would have to stay in their districts and vote remotely, and maybe we could spread spread all of this out, and so there'd be like less connection between social life and regular life. But I don't know if that would actually work.
I mean, I think there definitely, what you're saying is definitely true that there's a connection. But, like, I was there and, you know, came from a very liberal background and worked for the AARP, and I actually still do some freelance blogging for the AARP, which is, and then I hung out with a lot of conservatives, I hung out with a lot of libertarians, and I wasn't strictly, like, of any sort of persuasion, and I never found that it was necessarily a problem. So, like, at least among the, like, younger people in D.C., I feel like, yes, it is an environment that encourages you to be a certain way, but, like, it's, I don't know, if you have idiosyncratic beliefs, it's not like you say, you know, like, you won't get invited to this or you won't get invited to that. I don't know that happens, and if that does happen, then, like, it doesn't matter, because then they're like, you'll get invited to the next party or something. I don't think it's, like, as intense of a pressure as people say it is.
Yeah, I guess the way I would put it is that, you know, I also lived there and had friends from different ideological persuasions. I would say that there is a community of people in DC, in DC journalism specifically, that value the things that I value, some of the things that you value, that value public discourse and that value sort of openness to ideas and debate and the tolerance of people with different perspectives and the sort of trust that everyone is ultimately trying to work to improve things, broadly construed. I think that that's a little bit easier if you're working for, you know, for AARP like you were, if you're working for The Atlantic like I was, than if you're working for, say, the Heritage Foundation, or if you're working for AEI, or you know, even like Cato, one of the think tanks that is my favorite of the DC think tanks. I certainly felt freer to speak my mind about any topic at the Atlantic, where the sort of official motto is of no party or clique, than people at Cato who you know, have certain donors that you don't want to make angry. And I'm not talking about anything specific. I'm not privy to like that information, but you know, they're like a donor-driven organization. I
think, well, obviously, that happens, but I don't think, like you said, I think that's anywhere. I mean, obviously, DC and the proximity of people does facilitate it somewhat, but you don't need really DC to facilitate it. I mean, like, we started off this conversation talking about, you know, Hugo Schweizer, or I don't know how to pronounce his last name, and feminists in the blogosphere, and I think, you know, that you see the same thing happening. You see this kind of, you're sort of rewarded for following like a consensus about feminism, and if you have any sort of like beliefs or idiosyncratic like tendencies within that, then you are not as, you know, you're pushed to follow the line, and you're pushed to follow, if you're agreed, you're pushed to agree with people, and I think that's kind of the same thing with DC.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think that made any sense, but
no, I think it did. I was following along, I think. Well, great. It was fun. I think we should cut it off there. We're about an hour, but I hope we do it again sometime, and it was great talking to you.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thanks.